it's really about stepping back and trying to look at the system as a whole and your small part in it. And, your daily pursuit becomes fairly targeted, purposeful, intentional, and attentive. But at the same time, you're not too wrapped up in the outcomes. You're there as present as you can be. And then over time, you just hope that the compound efforts of that type of attentional and intentional effort from maybe many millions of people adds up to something.
Welcome to Mindful AI, the podcast that delves into the world of AI and its responsible use and development. I'm your host, Natasha Fong. I'm the founder of Zenta, a provider of mindfulness programs for workplaces. In this podcast, we'll hear from thought leaders in tech industry, academia, and mindfulness so that the layperson like myself can be smarter when thinking about the important topic of mindfulness in AI development and use. Today, I am delighted to speak with Nathan Kinch. Nate became fascinated by the fields he now studies and practices when building his first startup, which was a predictive analytics company seeking to reduce certain types of injuries in elite sports. Since then, he's been an entrepreneur in residence, an applied researcher with collaborators like CSIRO, Northwestern University, and the Consumer Policy Research Center. He's an active angel investor with 76 impact-focused investments and advisor to major corporations and government departments around the world on topics like generative AI, ethics, consumer data sharing, food system transformation, and trust in modern information technologies. Nate is based in Melbourne. Nate, it's great to have you on this podcast.
Look, absolute pleasure to be here, Natasha. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have this conversation. I'd love you to start by giving a brief background on your interest and experience in AI.
I'll do the TLDR summary because otherwise these things can go on for a while. I was an athlete when I was a kid and I really wanted that to be my life and I thought it was going to be my life. And, you have this view of how things are going to work out. And unfortunately, recurring injury meant that was a no-go. I was living in the States at the time, came back home, first acknowledged existential crisis. Who am I? What am I going to do? How am I going to contribute? What do I care about? All this type of stuff. I think I was 18 or so at the time. And after about a year, ended up coming back to the injury thing and thought, that's a bit of an issue, isn't it? And no idea what I was doing, had never built a business, hadn't raised venture capital, was only just being introduced to things like customer development from Steve Blank and the lean startup from Eric Ries, and then, other sort of areas of scholarship, raise funding, and then built a company that was using machine learning to predict the propensity that elite athletes had to incur soft tissue injuries. And so I am not an AI researcher. I am not an ML engineer. I'm not many things. What am I? Who knows? That identity question can potentially come another time. But that was really my first exposure to this space. And the biggest thing that came out of that for me was not like tactically what we were doing or the utility of what we were doing, but rather the broader sort of sociological, system level and philosophical implications of the information technologies that we were building. The ways in which human values impact the technologies that we design, the ways in which those technologies, when they go out into the world and we start using them in expected ways, in unexpected ways, and there is this sort of spectrum of consequences that results from that. Like, how does that then reinforce or contest or challenge or shape our values? And what's that whole process like? And so that started this, it's the blue pill, red pill thing, or it's Alice diving into Wonderland. It started a real sort of deep inquiry across many different disciplines. And since then, I've been focusing on what you might frame as socio-technical ethics or socio-technology ethics. I've been looking very deliberately at the ways in which we can build privacy, rights-enhancing technologies, the ways in which information technologies can contribute to key determinants of human flourishing, the ways in which these technologies can contribute to us as a species, a custodial species, living healthily within the constraints of the biosphere. So asking big questions and then often boiling that down to very pragmatic stuff. And I've been fortunate to engage in lots of different projects and initiatives, from deep philosophy through to applied research, through to actually building a lot of stuff, including things like the consumer data right here in Australia. And a thread that has remained present and prominent, but absolutely bonkers as of the last months, which is why we're here, has obviously been the broad and very varied field of artificial intelligence. Many of the big questions that we're asking today remain well and truly unanswered. And there's plenty of questions that I think we're not asking. I'm just trying to play my tiny little role as part of the madness that is us exploring what it means to exist and to exist well.
Absolutely. I think a lot of us are doing that. So I have had a lot of guests bring up the challenge of trust in AI, and given your background in designing for trustworthiness, can you talk a bit about what that means? What does trust mean, or trustworthiness? Can you just give us a little bit of a background?
Yeah, it's a really interesting space because I've focused on what does it mean for an information technology or an information technology designer to be trustworthy for a bit more than a decade now. And because we study trust and trustworthiness in different fields, sociology, philosophy, economics, neuroscience, etc. And at the same time, as there are many sophisticated scholars trying to unpack and make sense of this phenomenology, we as individuals, in a popular sense, have an intuitive sense of what trust is, right? And I think that sometimes is misleading. So there are many different theories of trust. Most of them propose that trust is at least partly cognitive. So it's sort of like a mental process that party A executes in their attempt to assess whether or not party B is worthy of their trust in the context of C. So it's relational. It involves typically at least two parties. It's sort of somewhat context specific. There might be some type of outcome orientation. There is a shared purpose. There's something motivating the pursuit of a given relationship. The types of characteristics that party A will look to assess when you're like, hey, is party B trustworthy? We could describe this in different ways, but the three most common characteristics of trustworthiness are integrity, benevolence, and competence. And by competence, we really mean the consistency with which party B can deliver its value promise. But that doesn't tell us the full picture because we are biopsychosocial creatures. Nothing happens only in the head or in the mind, or however we want to think about that. And we still don't have a particularly robust theory of consciousness. We don't know how does the mind emerge from mere matter? Is everything consciousness to some extent? There's lots of different, we're not talking about philosophy of mind, so I'll push that to the side. But I would suggest that trust is partly cognitive, it's partly emotional. It seems to be influenced by many different factors, our upbringing, our DNA, the cultural context within which we exist. All of those things impact our propensity to trust. And so it's kind of a complex space. So where do we get to? How do we make pragmatic sense of that so that we can act on it? And my working definition for trust tends to be the belief in another party's trustworthiness. And then we kind of go, cool, all right, so what do we mean by trustworthiness? What are we trying to assess? And most of my work focuses on what it means for an organization or institution to be trustworthy. So I have a particular lens that I'm applying, and I can look at that from the perspective of integrity, competence, and benevolence. But I actually really like a model from Hilary Sutcliffe and colleagues that was published in, from memory, early 2020. And if you're interested, you can go to tigtech.org to check out some of that work. And that has 7 qualities of trustworthiness. So the first is intent to act in the public's best interest. The second is sort of integrity, operating honestly, being accountable, impartial, etc. The third is fairness. The fourth is respect. The fifth is openness. The sixth is inclusion. And the seventh is competence. So in a lot of my work, I look to go, all right, we have quite a robust model that describes what it means to be trustworthy. And again, in my case, I'm looking at what it means for an organization or institution to be trustworthy. How do we design organizational features or characteristics or an entire organizing structure that brings those qualities to life consistently? And then the next piece of the puzzle is, well, how do we give other parties, customers, investors, regulators, stakeholders of different kinds, good evidence of those qualities, characteristics, or organizational features to assist in their process of assessing whether or not they want to trust us in a given context? So that's kind of the way that I think about that. When we look at AI, if it's okay to go there, it's a slightly different process. So if we assume that, again, trust is at least partly cognitive and therefore at least partly rational, because we are not Homo economicus, but we certainly have the capacity for critical thought and rationality. It's just not that we are solely critical thinking or rational, or however you want to describe it. There's much more to the whole that is the human being and the human species. So if we assume that trust is at least partly cognitive or partly rational, we look at that, and if we're to say, can you trust AI? Like, that's a terribly broad question. Well, let's ask a slightly more specific question. Can you trust model B in the context of C, like some outcome orientation that you have, some purpose that you have for using the model? And that could be something small or concrete. The context of C probably doesn't matter too much now. You want to look at that and go, okay, well, how am I going to assess trustworthiness? And we have lots of values that we try to design into models, privacy, fairness, justice. We're obviously deeply concerned about bias. Whenever we're training a model on human data sets, there's going to be some bias in there, folks. So there's lots of things that we're looking at. But there's a real big, what we might call knowledge issue. There are epistemological constraints, like, I have the philosophy of knowledge, our theory of knowledge. And if we can't explain how a model is producing certain outputs, and that explanation is causally necessary in terms of our understanding, and understanding is causally necessary in terms of assessing whether the model is trustworthy or not, it's like, oh my gosh, can we ever trust this model? Now, there's sort of other ways to look at it. We could look at different parameters to assess trustworthiness, but that's a really big one that I've been thinking about quite critically and quite deeply lately. There's been sort of popular rhetoric around the trustworthiness of AI and can we trust AI and all this different type of stuff. And my current assessment is that if we remain unable to explain some of this stuff, it really limits our understanding. And sometimes this might be referred to as sort of like an emergent property of the model. It limits our capacity for understanding, and our capacity for understanding being limited limits our capacity to develop a belief in the trustworthiness of the model. And so will that always be the case? I have no idea. My guess is as good as the next person. But so that's a way to think about it, and then and to start applying it to some of the challenges and frankly opportunities that we're faced with these large language models that are proliferating and generative AI more broadly.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is that you're suggesting, rather than focus on whether we can trust AI, let's focus on designing for trustworthiness.
Absolutely, yeah, and making really clear what we mean by that. Making really clear what we mean by that. A few years ago, a lot of the literature on sort of trust in AI looked to sociologically interpret trust. And then often we were looking at things like explainability and stuff like that. And if that's sort of out the window, we need to approach things a different way. Maybe that looking at some of the stuff like constitutional AI, where we're sort of constraining to some extent so that the model isn't as free and easy, if you will. There's lots of different ways that we might look at it. But the question that's worth asking is, can we design something that is trustworthy, whatever that means? And I'm open to lots of different interpretations in different contexts. And then assessing the capacity that we have to verify that trustworthiness through myriad different practices at sort of different levels and over a period of time.
Right. So what would be the steps needed to build AI that is trustworthy? And then part two to the question, what about the constraints?
Yeah, I'll tackle this, if you don't mind, by stepping back a little further. There are a lot of good practitioners, scholars that are so much better placed to describe the actual day-to-day practices of model designers. That is not my expertise. And I want to be really clear with everyone listening that I have, I think, a reasonable capacity to know some of my knowledge limits, and I'd like to leave aspects of that question for others. But there's sort of a precondition here that's really important, and I don't know how much airtime it's being given. So, for a long time, since pre-Aristotle in the West, and there are many equivalents in the East, often with different interpretations and different sort of metaphysical positions, we've been asking, well, what does it mean for a human to flourish? What does it mean to live well? And the way that we answered it a couple of thousand years ago, either in the East or the West, is probably a little bit different to the way that we answer it now. A lot of that stuff has carried through. It's had like an enduring contribution to our sense-making processes. But since science has developed to such an extent, I think we can kind of augment that capacity. One of the common meta theories is self-determination theory. And it sort of describes certain characteristics that are causally implicated in a human being living well. And there's a model that I like that's sort of been built on that and other literature from Dorian Peters and Rafael Calvo, who used to be at the Positive Computing Lab in Sydney, and they're now at different institutions. But they developed this thing called the happy camper model. And camper, C-A-M-P-E-R. So C for competence, A for autonomy, M for meaning, P for positive emotions, E for engagement, and R for relatedness. And so that's describing different well-being determinants. Now, my take here is that a precondition of trustworthy model development ought to be, and I'm happy to make a normative claim about what we should be doing. And there will be people that disagree with this, and that's totally okay. I think it's worth celebrating that. And I think we can engage in discourse that is compassionate and respectful and thoughtful and integrous. And I'm very happy to meet that disagreement there. I think we ought to be designing these models with an explicit orientation towards enhancing those determinants or other determinants, depending on the model that we're using, explicitly designing these models to enhance those determinants of well-being. And that really touches on the benevolence category, if you will, or in the Hilary Sutcliffe model, the intent to act in the public's best interest. The other thing that I think we need to be doing, and I'll just clarify really quickly, Natasha, I don't think there's as much focus in the sort of AI ethics space on those types of points of view or lenses or orientations as there maybe should be. So I think that's a really important precondition, and it really touches on the benevolence piece. The other is, we've known since as late as 72, but probably before that, thanks to the work of Donna Meadows and colleagues at MIT, they published a report that to this day has been profoundly impactful in terms of our understanding of the collection of human activities and how they impact the biosphere. And the report was titled Limits to Growth. And what it basically said was, if we keep growing our economies collectively 2 to 3% year on year, because we can't decouple economic growth from resource extraction, then production, and then consumption, we'll run out of resources. And that's where we are, folks. We are operating far beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. And so one of the areas that I'm exploring is, can we have trustworthy AI in the context of a paradigm of growthism? We are obsessed with economic growth specifically via, frankly, arbitrary metrics in many cases like GDP. GDP is misused in many cases, at least relative to its original intention. And the additional precondition here is not just we need to design for human flourishing, but we need to design for human flourishing within the constraints of the biosphere. Because if we don't have a biosphere that gives us water, and reliable agricultural output, and breathable air, and a stable enough climate to not exist in just this constant state of fear, then I think it's really hard for us to, even through these practical workflows, the model designers and others, because we've got cross-functional or transdisciplinary teams nowadays contributing to these processes. If we're not starting there, then I have a real concern that anything we do tactically, practically, legislatively will really meet the needs of today and, importantly, meet the emergent needs of tomorrow. So it's probably quite a different way of attempting to answer part of that question. And I've deliberately avoided some of the model development stuff because it isn't my expertise. I'm very happy to contribute to those processes, but only as part of a cross-functional team where there are different capabilities. But I feel capable enough to contribute to some of that preconditional stuff that I think is really important. And frankly, that's where I believe philosophy in combination with other disciplines can play a really prominent role.
Can you give a bit of color around how you are working with companies to design trustworthiness as part of this cross-disciplinary team?
Yeah, totally. Oh my gosh. So let me start on one end of the spectrum. By that, I mean just getting started, small scale organizations through to big behemoth Fortune 500s, because it's a totally different operating space. Now, most of my commercial work is with government departments, big corporations, etc. But I have quite a balanced portfolio. I do a lot of pro bono work. 30 to 40% at least of my week is pro bono work, sometimes more. And then I play in different spaces. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment is as an ethicist in residence at a small VC fund. We are building basically an approach to practical ethics, drawing on a pluralistic approach to moral theory. We're looking at different moral theories, trying to make sense of their strengths, and then incorporate them into how we deliberate and how we assess investment opportunities. We inform our investment process or augment our investment process through this ethical reflection and deliberation. So in an organization like that, that's quite small, that has lots of competing priorities, that has many decision-making variables to prominently feature. They're looking at team and traction and market and timing and all of these typical things like how good's the tech stack, blah, 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 blah. I might look at ethical debt, but they'll be looking at technical debt. And we engage in fairly simple practices. So we have this idea of a principles assessment. And so we have a series of principles, and we've actually drawn in this case from work that Dr. Matt Beard and Dr. Simon Longstaff published in 2018 from the Ethics Center, Ethical by Design Principles for Good Tech. And there's a series of 8 principles there that are really powerful, and they draw from different moral theories. And so when we're assessing an investment opportunity, in this particular case, and it could be an AI company, it could be something else, right? Because I work across lots of different contexts. We're basically assessing how strong the fit is between that company, its proposition, the likely consequences of its actions, and the principles. And then we're using that to inform our process. We then have quite consequential approaches. So that's drawing on particularly virtue ethics, deontology, and some sort of utilitarianism or consequentialism. But then we have much more quantifiable approaches where we're looking to explore the spectrum of consequences, both intended and unintended, that may arise from what this company is trying to do. How likely are they? How significant are they? What's the effect size? What are the things that we can encourage that startup to do in order to amplify the good and mitigate or minimize the bad? And that informs the investment process, but also encourages us to find practical ways to do more good. And this is a really practical orientation, very imperfect, and a deep humility. It's just a real learning process. And again, that can be applied across different industries, contexts, life stages, etc. On the other end of the spectrum, I spend a lot of time building systems for ethical decision-making for much larger organizations. Again, these are context agnostic. They will interface with a lot of like RAI work, like responsible AI work. I know that different companies will kind of call it different things, but within many corporations, RAI is quite a prominent framing. You know, some of the like big professional services firms will call it responsible AI or trustworthy AI, but you know, it's sort of context agnostic. So what do I mean by a system for ethical decision-making? What we're really trying to do is create a sort of like socio-technical infrastructure that features tools, mental models, processes, procedures, desired behaviors, undesired behaviors, and we're trying to bring it together to describe the process that we execute in various different organizational contexts, the tools that we call upon, the people that we invite into the process, in order to engage in these reflective processes to assess how aligned a given initiative or project is to our purpose, values, and principles. How aligned is it to that which we believe to be good and right? And that can play out in lots of different ways. When it comes to the AI space or the machine learning space as a subset or child to that, the big parent, there's lots of very practical stuff that will feed into that. And people do model cards and all these different types of things, different training practices, reinforcement learning with human feedback. Like there's a lot of different practices that are in play. But again, this system for ethical decision-making basically provide consistent structure to encourage reflection, deliberation, active participation, diversity, inclusion, consideration of the spectrum of consequences, et cetera, et cetera. And it creates a more robust framework within which we can try and describe what we're trying to do, who we're trying to do it for, the consequences that we will accept or deliberately design for, the consequences that we simply won't accept and that we want to design away from, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that is very much like an organizational design initiative, which is the space that I like to play most, because if we have the capacity to affect and effect the way that the board thinks about corporate governance, the way that executive committees think about the authorizing environment that they create for their respective business units or operational functions, then it's much easier to change the target behaviors that are consistently exhibited within an organizational setting. And it's much more likely, as a result, that we can consistently exhibit those 7 qualities of trustworthiness from the Hillary Sutcliffe model that I described.
So now you work with these specific organizations from early stage or small to large organizations.
Yeah.
Are you seeing across the board in this race that we have in developing AI that companies are taking into consideration those trustworthy design models and systems?
Yes, it's such a good question. I'd say that there are some common characteristics and they're changing, right? So a few years ago, like very few people were talking about this, and AI ethics is like really a brand new thing. Like it was only 2016 that Luciano Floridi and colleagues published their paper for the Royal Society, like what is data ethics? Prior to that, we had information ethics and then AI ethics came after that. Now, that isn't to say there hasn't been philosophical inquiry into the AI space for decades, because there has. I just mean it's a formal field that's framed and described and packaged. One of the things that I would say is trending in various different organizations is an epistemic humility that I think is beginning to play out, because there's a collective sense of not knowing. It's like things are moving so fast and we don't know. It's really confusing and I just can't keep up. And there's a real tension there because we exist in a paradigm within which knowing is valuable. And many of the spaces that we're entering into, we just can't know yet. And maybe there is no absolute right or wrong either. You know, there are different positions on that, realism versus relativism, etc. That's one thing. And I think that's playing out in small organizations, and it creates different fears and anxieties, whether it's a small organization, a big organization, an organization that has a corporate risk sort of appetite that's fairly ambitious, an organization that has a corporate risk appetite that's very conservative. Another thing that I think we're seeing is just like a desire to act, like this sort of like this propensity to act that we haven't seen in the past. And I'm seeing this, if you think about typical structure of a corporation, you've kind of got pressure from particularly institutional investors, what we might colloquially refer to as mum and pop investors. The pressure doesn't come from them, it comes from institutional investors, your BlackRocks, your big super funds. If it's here in Australia, there are different ways to look at this. That pressure goes to the board. The board's responsible for corporate governance. Corporate governance is broadly about 2 things: 1, setting strategy, and 2, identifying and mitigating corporate risk. That then gets handed down to the CEO. The CEO is effectively employed by the board, hired and fired by the board, etc. And then that makes its way throughout the organization. So every organization, because of these pressures, is now like, oh, we need a generative AI strategy. And there's a lot of doing, but there's not a huge amount of deliberation. And I really sympathize with why that is, because there's a lot of pressure and people are feeling a lot of pressure. And I think a lot of that comes from this rhetoric that it is a zero-sum game. Was it Bill Gates that came out? The person who wins the AI race, like even that language is so destructive and confrontational, and it's not serving us as a species, as a custodial species that needs to find a healthy operating space with each other and within the biosphere. But the first company to win the AI race will be the first one to like nail a personal AI assistant type of thing. And whether that's true or not, it's just a speculation. When it comes to the practical things, there was a report that was released that looked at responsible AI maturity here in Australia. And we're seeing similar data. MIT, the Sloan School of Management, published something recently as well. Most directors and executives, and also like RAI sort of experts, would believe that there is a lack of maturity and we're not ready for this stuff. And the report here in Australia basically suggested that only 3% of organizations had anything that could be likened to a mature, responsible AI practice within the organization. Like that's tiny, because all of these organizations are now doing stuff in AI. And it's hard to know how much sort of credence to give, how much confidence to assign to that, like, because there's a lot of subjectivity in that. That's a kind of scary thing. And I think there's somewhat of a recognition of that as well. And then the last one that's here that I'm seeing play out in lots of different contexts is this toggling between utopia, like AI is going to solve everything. It's going to make us so productive and it's going to free us up and it's going to do all these different types of things. And then we get into Jevons paradox territory and stuff like that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's very existential. Like this is going to be civilizational ending. And that's a real emotional and sort of psychological roller coaster that people are going on. And I think everyone's having their own like lived human phenomenological experience with that dynamic. And it's really hard to make sense of. So yeah, we're in that space now where we kind of got to embrace that unknowing and we've got to find a way to go on this journey towards knowing together.
Yeah. And I'm going to quote one of your articles that you have on Substack.
Yeah.
You say that you feel pretty confident that a more compassionate, open, curious, and humble approach grounded in some serious rigor can help us move in a direction where generative AI is far more positive than negative. Can you talk a bit about that, about what this rigor could look like?
I think that the rigor part is only one variable in there. And it's maybe, this might sound blasphemous, but it's maybe the least important. Now, that isn't to say it's not important. It's massively important because everything that we're doing now is very consequential, really consequential. We're seeing warring factions. You have different folks in the sort of AI ethics space saying, no, this is the way. And then the other folks on the other end of the spectrum are saying, this is the way. And a lot of their unproductive discourse is playing out on social media. Whoa, big surprise. Didn't see that happening. And the dogmas and the ideologies, I think, are constraining our capacity to act with a collective wisdom, to coexist with these tensions, to respect the plurality of values. And it's inhibiting the integrity of this shared process that we absolutely need to enact in order to steer that which we are doing collectively as a species in a more beneficial direction. And it's also hard, Natasha, to look at AI in a vacuum. I don't think you can. Because, so one of the problems that we have at the moment, these models are trained on basically everyone's data, but you've only got 4 billion people connected to the internet. Half of the people on this planet aren't represented at all, and the AI probably shouldn't be looked at outside of socio-political and socioeconomic context. AI probably shouldn't be looked at outside of the narratives about who we are and what we are and where we come from and why we exist and our purpose for being. It shouldn't exist outside of an environmental or ecological context. It shouldn't exist outside of a human rights context. This is where sort of system scientists and complexity theorists have a really important role to play, because this is part of the system. This is not separate to the system. That's the stuff that I really think we need to focus. If you were to frame this as a belief or even a hypothesis, perhaps, I think we will be more rigorous. We will be more experimental. We will create collaborative constructs within which we can do more qualitative work, more intentional work on these issues and opportunities if the warring factions feel more like a diverse tribe, right? Like we coexist in this thing. That for me is the most important stuff. I feel like the technical rigor, we can figure that out. Like the stuff that we have invented as a species, like it's amazing. It's absolutely incredible. But the sort of sociological stuff, we got a really long way to go.
Right. And bringing it down to the individual level, you talk about shared process and the collective, but that collective is made up of individuals. We've talked about the roller coaster and overwhelm of where AI is currently at. You come across as someone who's pretty balanced around this area. You have a steady perspective amongst the spectrum of perspectives. How do you personally manage through this mushrooming downpour of all the AI developments going on?
My approach to this space at the moment is very much to try and look at it in the context of the full picture. I think it's really important. So, how do you frame something like that? Well, you can look at other systems that we rely on, like the food system as a for instance. Again, we're operating beyond the capacity of the biosphere. We waste 30 to 50% of the food, the calories that we produce. Somewhere between 700 million and 1 billion people don't know where they're getting their next meal from. At the same time, we have massive rise in diseases of excess, overconsumption, etc., or rather just directionally incorrect consumption, too many ultra processed foods or whatever it might be. You have, over the last 40 to 50 years, you've had $50 trillion of value flow from the bottom 50% to the top 1%. Inequality is at an all-time high. The world is the best it's ever been, and it's the worst it's ever been. And I think it's really important to hold that view as best you can. So I try and look at AI in the sort of developmental context of our species and our sort of relationship to existence. At the level of the individual, any one of us can only do so much. We will neither make or break the system. When you kind of ground that, it gives you a humility of some description, and it also gives you not necessarily a grounded confidence, but a grounded hopefulness. If each of us approaches this with some level of wisdom, and we then find our ways into different groups and communities and cohorts, then there's a reasonable likelihood that we're able to figure some of this stuff out. You've got to hold that hope in tension with the fact that it's going to be what it is, and drawing on different things. So this is informed by philosophy, this is informed by science, this is informed by contemplative disciplines in the East, particularly Tibetan Buddhist practices, some of the Hindu practices. There's a lot of deep wisdom in those cultures, in those stories, in those mythologies, in the metaphysics there. It's really about stepping back and trying to look at the system as a whole and your small part in it, and balancing that hope in the fact that things might be better with a radical acceptance of the fact that maybe they won't. And, your daily pursuit becomes fairly targeted and purposeful and intentional and attentive, but at the same time, you're not too wrapped up in the outcomes. You're there as present as you can be, as realistically as you can be present. And then over time, you just hope that the compound efforts of that type of attentional and intentional effort from maybe many millions of people adds up to something. I draw a lot on contemplative disciplines, philosophy, and different insights from the cognitive and neurosciences. And I don't think it's a magic bullet. It's just little old me trying to integrate different perspectives and make some sense of what all of this is, and maybe some small capacity that I have to contribute.
Wonderful. Nate, just one last question before we wrap up. Who or what sources do you follow to stay updated on AI?
I'm really fortunate. I connected to a lot of really interesting people just on LinkedIn, right? So I'm off Twitter. I haven't been on Facebook for a very, very long time, and I've never been on Insta or TikTok or any of these things. So really all I have left is LinkedIn, and it sort of feels like a necessary evil sometimes. If you pay too much attention to the constant scrolling, that can lead you down different unhealthy rabbit holes. But I've managed to somewhat cultivate a feed of very diverse thinkers that represent different fields. They come from very different conditional upbringings, different parts of the world. They're completely sort of behavioralist, or they're very spiritual. The thread there that ties it all together, they're just very high quality thinkers. And some of them are philosophers. Some of them are AI researchers and have been for many decades. Others are system scientists, some are behavioral scientists, some are designers, some are complexity theorists or system scientists. I don't think there's any one person. There are some people that are a bit closer to me in my inner network that I have some very deep sort of reflective discussions with that I find very gratifying. I've tried to cultivate an ecosystem, if you will, that just progressively erodes my ignorance on a daily basis. You have some great organizations doing awesome work in this space, do like Responsible AI Institute, and then you've got a lot of the leading universities publishing great work, and even Medium previously, and then the rise of Substack. Like, you've got a lot of great individuals publishing. Importantly, like, there's lots of folks who's like many views like I'll fundamentally disagree with, and I have good reason to disagree with them, but that's part of the process in terms of developing, not claiming that I am wise, but trying to cultivate some sort of sense of wisdom, and to just lean into that daily process of attempting to erode ignorance. That's a lifelong. I have no intention of stopping or slowing down. Cultivate an ecosystem of qualitative yet diverse thinkers, and hopefully that will help you.
I like that. I like the idea of eroding ignorance, which is certainly one of my intentions with this podcast. So thanks so much, Nate. I really loved your perspective, your experience, and the color that you've brought to this conversation. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you for tuning into Mindful AI. I hope that our conversation has provided you with valuable insights and perspectives on the fascinating developments in AI. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite platform. Also, don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media or via our website at Center Meditation to share your thoughts and suggestions for future episodes. Thanks again for listening to Mindful AI, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful conversations in the future.